My name is Andrew Turgeon. I currently live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, working on the IBM Watson team. And my presentation to you today is going to be about growing up with globalization. It's basically a 30-minute experience report about my process of globalizing an application that we call Watson Explorer. So I'm going to take you back to a situation where at the beginning, you didn't really have something. You started from scratch. And it's great because you have all these different possibilities. You get to come up with all the features that you want and basically, please the customers as you want. So as you start, you're going to start adding things like, say, a logo, maybe some buttons for some user interaction, and add a search bar because everyone likes searching things. Then we add some navigation, some mirrored footer navigation. And then you start adding some content, like an activity feed. And you have, kind of like your Facebook style thing. And then everyone loves graphs, so you add some visualization and some more content. So things are going great. You have this great web application. All of this text is on the screen, y'all's numbers and stuff. But then you get a new customer. They're a little different, though, from all the other customers you've had so far. They have some other requirements that you didn't really consider at the very beginning. They require 8 different languages other than English. They also want all of your data formats, all of your data to be culturally specific to the clients that they're serving. They also have different time zones that they serve across the world. It's not just in the US, in your Eastern time zone, or I guess in our case, Western. And out of those 8 languages, one of them is Arabic, which has bidirectional considerations that need to be taken account of. So unfortunately, it would have been nice to know about all these requirements prior to starting, because now, with this huge application that you've written, you're going to have to go back and rewrite a bunch of parts in it because you didn't think that language should ever be an abstraction in your application. So my goal today is basically to tell you, some of the experiences that I've had taking an application that didn't consider globalization at the beginning and kind of walk through the steps that are necessary to take it to a situation where you are, and kind of describe some of the pain points and main pitfalls that you might encounter while doing it. So just a brief agenda. We're going to talk about some statistics, kind of give you some motivation for this. We're going to talk about what globalization is. Then we're going to get started with some basic stuff that you need at the very beginning. Some basic implementation in the Ruby on Rails application that we're going to frame our problem around. We're going to talk about variables and pluralization, which are common things that you need to consider when doing these internationalization tactics. Talk about culture-specific data formats, any considerations that you need to worry about with bidirectional languages, and then also testing. How do we know at the end that we've done a good job and we're going to be good for the future? And then at the end, I'll give some takeaways that I plan on you getting out of this presentation, hopefully, and we can talk later afterwards, your opinions of the presentation. This doesn't intend to be an entire overview of globalization. It's just going to focus on my experiences of internationalizing the application. I don't claim to be a globalization expert, so be warned. So statistics. In the whole Internet of Things mindset, the reason I thought it would be a good idea to kind of center around the internet usage. Right now, we have about 26%. In 2015, 26% of the internet traffic was done by users who speak English or prefer it. The other 74% is not English. That's a pretty big chunk of people that aren't going to basically like your English-only application. To go along with that, you also have some statistics growth in the last 15 years. Down here, you have English at 520% between the years of 2000 and 2015. But the penetration of other languages like Arabic, Russian, and Chinese are much higher than that, along with several other languages. And this is important to consider when you're developing your applications because a lot of business opportunities exist there that you might not be able to seize in the case that your competitor might step in that has already done it. Another important topic going along with the time zones is I noticed here on this computer it's actually saying that it's 6 o'clock. That's not actually accurate right now because it's actually 3 here. But the interesting part is that there's a lot of different traffic across all the time zones in the world. And not your application, even if you're just in the US, has to consider at least 4 different time zones. And don't even get me started about daylight savings time because that ends up being a whole mess. Fortunately for us, there's lots of frameworks and libraries out there that have already taken control of this situation. You just need to think about it when you're developing your applications. So I get it. There's some motivation there, but what do I need to do? How hard is it to take my application from an English-only application to something that's global? So what is globalization? Basically, it's a two-step process. We're going to talk about internationalization in this presentation, which is basically the process of pulling strings out of the UI and putting into a key-value lookup store. The second step is localization, which is predominantly done by translators, which is taking the strings that you've pulled out of the UI and turning them into the languages that you need to support. So we're just going to focus on the internationalization aspect in this talk. So, and to give some framing around it, we're going to talk about Watson Explorer, which is the application that I worked on. As you can see, there's tons of English text here and like lots of dates and times and stuff. So it's important that we're able to display all of this information in any other language if we're going to consider ourselves global. So let's get started. With a Ruby on Rails application, which Watson Explorer is, the very basics that you need to start is to be able to set the locale. The locale of the different of the user who's logged in is usually the best way to get it. So there was some talk earlier yesterday about message interceptors. One way to do it is to basically have some sort of around action or before action handler in Rails that allows you to kind of intercept the message before you start doing any other processing. And you can either grab the user's preferences for the locale, which you would store in some sort of database somewhere, or you can extract it from the accept language header. I would suggest that it's best to always get it from the user because they know best what they want. And you can assign it to the best language that you support based on some algorithm. But if you can't, then you can basically have get it from the request, which is an accept language header. Once you do that, it's always important to embed it in your HTML tags on your page so that they know what language you're displaying your text in, so that the browser knows. And screen readers can also know what language to present to the users. So let's get started with a really basic example in the Rails world. We have a basic input box with a button, and we have some text on here. To generate this kind of input mechanism for users, we have some code in a galaxy far, far away that looks kind of like this. And it basically is just a submit tag with some post as the text, a CSS class of button, ARIA label of post, and also kind of a processing attribute of posting ... This is typically a bad way to start with internationalization. You want to make sure that you can pull all these strings into key value lookups. So these key value lookups are presented in Rails and it's given to you for free. Rails basically has a ITNN framework embedded that gives you this translation helper or T helper that we can see here. So to go along with these calls, we basically have a backing data store. We chose to use YAML for our data store, but you can use other things. And it helps to basically make these keys easily hierarchical so that you can look up in context where these strings exist. So Rails kind of rewards you for making sure that all these translations are done in the presentation layers. So this is included in like your views and your controllers rather than in the model layers. If you can use the T helper, you can be pretty sure that you're using your translations in the right spot. Some of the best practices I found with making these translations, though, is never to reuse the same text, even though you think you can. I try to tell my team all the time to take off your developer hat when doing internationalization and put on your globalization hat, because we only speak English, so we only think that words can be used in the same context all the time, but that's not always the case. Certain words might be used for different purposes in different languages, and it's best, unless you can talk to a translator, to enumerate all the different possibilities in the UI and make sure that all of them have their own spot in your YAML files. And the other important part is to always have hierarchies with short keys. This isn't really a requirement, but it's something that I found is best practice. It helps because when you're working with larger teams, it allows you to split out the workload and keep things consolidated into the parts of the UI. If you can go the route of having super long keys, but it makes it harder to maintain, and it's also kind of difficult to come up with the key names at that point. This kind of lends itself to the object-oriented approach and allows you to kind of manage it across multiple teams and multiple files. Another small note here is always use the ellipsis character, not the 3 dots. It's a small, minute difference, but it's important because whenever using word processors, it does it for you. But in this translation stuff, we found that people typically forget to use the actual ellipsis character, which has special meaning in different languages. So let's get into a more complicated example. Let's talk about variables and pluralization. So here we have a UI element that basically says no updates found. It's inherently related to some sort of numeric part of the UI. So to generate this, we have some complicated pluralization algorithm for English. Basically, you have something that's greater than 1, something that's equal to 1, and something that's 0. And we have 3 different values for those different texts. And this is kind of bad because it's very specific to English. It doesn't help us when we go to different languages, which have potentially more than that. Other languages, such as Arabic, have things like many, or few, or 2. So a better way to do it is use a translation helper, again. And you can pass in variables like count and display count here in this example. And to match up, we have our YAML file that accompanies it. And basically, you can see here that the count is actually a special variable that's used in order to activate the pluralization algorithm for the locale that you're set in. This helps us because now we can display the correct pluralization text that we plan on using based on the variables that are passed in. So, yeah, so the next part I was going to talk about is the HTML tag that I have in there. The important part that we found is that it's good to include as much context as you can. And sometimes people like to put styling around different text in the translation. So the 2 options are to split it out into different pieces of translation and then combine them all at the end, which makes it harder for translators to understand what you meant by the context. So it's usually better to include the entire contextual sentence or phrase that you have in the UI. And Rails provides a way to embed HTML tags into your translations to allow you to include that entire context along with your styles and stuff that you would potentially want to include as well. So this allows you to use interpolated variables for any sort of dynamic data, not just numbers. You can use other things. A word of caution, though, is to use variables with care. Anytime you use a variable, it takes away some of the context from a translator. It doesn't let them know what that is. You can give a meaningful semantic name to the variable, but at the end of the day, you're probably not going to have direct communication with a translator to tell them exactly what's going there. So you want to try to reduce the number of variables and try to be as explicit as possible in your translations. Just kind of try your best. And like I said before, more plural forms exist in other languages, so don't always rely on the fact that there's only 1, 2, or 0. So let's talk about culture-specific data formats. This includes things like dates, times, currencies, numbers. And these are important because a lot of times we have different sorts of visualizations. We like to display numbers and other sorts of dates and times in the UI. An important thing to realize here is that we have this date here, 4/1/2016, which to us means April 1st. But to other countries and other cultures, it might mean January 4th. And there's no real understanding there that you need to make sure that you provide the ability to abstract these formats of dates in a way that we can allow the user to understand what date you actually mean. So this is kind of a bad example. We have like a hard-coded date format string in our code base. So a better way to do it is to use the localization helper that Rails provides. You pass in the date value, and then you pass in a format that you want. And the formats are defined in these YAML files again. If I can get it to work. So as you can see, these date and time formats use typical date format strings that you can then specify either the defaults that Rails provides or your custom ones. And then when the translator goes to kind of come up with what the alternative would be for their language, you can switch things like the month and the day because you would know that. So this is kind of a required hierarchy that's used by Rails, but you can add additional custom ones if you need. So my best practices to go along this is always to define all of your formats, not just the custom ones that you make up. This allows you to keep everything in one spot and helps translators understand which things need to be translated. And then it also follows similar structure for like currency numbers and percentages. Time zones, another important thing that we need to worry about, mostly with the storage and consumption of them. Some best practices that I've found is that you should always store things in UTC, and specifically in ISO 6801, it just makes things easier to sort on, and it just standardizes the format. And anytime you consume it, you want to make sure that you get it back in the currently configured time zone for your application. So how do you set that currently configured time zone? Typically, we use time.now, which is bad. We want to use time.zone.now to make sure that we use the currently configured time zone for our application. And to set that, we basically have another sort of message interceptor for every request that comes in to basically grab it from the current user's time zone preferences. If you don't have access to the user or you don't have users logged in your application, there's also other methods to grab it from the request based on the browser that's submitting the request, but also less reliable than getting it from the user. Some example that I used this for was basically a time visualization that I had in JavaScript. I basically had to pull out the currently configured time zone that my application was set in and kind of use it with another library, Moment.js, which is a great library for JavaScript time zone stuff, and basically set the time zone offset so that when my time steps were formatted appropriately in the JavaScript layer, that I'm using the same exact configured time zone that I had set in the Ruby layer. Another consideration that I'm briefly going to talk about, because I'm not entirely familiar with bidirectional languages because I only speak English, but my best interpretation is not all languages read in the same direction. So we're all familiar from left to right. Browsers pretty much do this by default without any sort of modifications. As soon as you pass in the attribute of right to left, or RTL, it moves everything and has everything go from right to left. There's some interesting problems that occur with this, especially with your UIs. Browser handles a lot of it for you, as long as you use Unicode. So always use Unicode with if you're not already. I don't think anyone would be at this point. Those are the ways to specify it. And then sometimes if you do have to support both right to left and left to right languages at the same time, you're going to need to use embedded HTML tags in your text markup so that you have some sort of way to determine which part should be read from right to left and which part's left to right. This poses a pretty non-trivial problem because not all the time do you know your strings at compile time, what strings are going to be left to right and right to left. So this poses a bit of a challenge that you need to consider when developing your UI. Another important part is that since it's directional, all of your left to right stuff now needs to be flipped over. So anything that you've taken out of the document flow using any sort of CSS needs to now be flipped the other direction. And you need to either use a library to kind of generate those style sheets for you or go through and manually make sure that your application is flipped the other way. So you can see how that can be kind of a lot of work down the road to make sure that all of that UI is taken care of. For testing, we found that the best way to do is to basically have some sort of like static code analysis. We use the I18N task gem, which allows you to go through and find out translations that aren't used or translations that are asked for but aren't actually specified anywhere. And then also kind of testing some dynamic translations. If you ever try to do some dynamic translations, it's usually good to just test the framework to make sure that if anything changes with it, you have a few checks here and there to verify. The best way to do it would be to run an entire regression suite on the entire application, but it's not always practical to do that. You don't always have the time and resources to do it. So I found that this usually accomplishes most of it. So just kind of checking like that the default doesn't show up and that your actual translation does show up. When transitioning from a non-internationalized application to an internationalized application, I found that it's good to create some sort of like foo language pack or some sort of longer language pack to kind of verify that you've actually found all the strings in your UI. This helps with finding out like, oh, I missed this one because it's not foo. And it helps for people who don't speak other languages to be able to test this out. And I found it as a pretty good solution for that. It also helps with people who don't, if you have a screen reader, it helps read out all those different attributes. So going through some of the takeaways that I kind of want you to get out of this presentation is that you should always treat language as an abstraction from the beginning. The longer you wait, the more difficult it's going to be to go through and make all these changes that I kind of talked about. And like I said, the database? I'm not sure what the question was.
Sometimes you have, as part of the database,
Mm-hmm.
things you have to show in the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And they are also that you need to translate.
Right. So if the database values aren't if I treat that the database values aren't part of our UI, they're part of the data, and you will pass them in as like variables to those translation strings, because we can't know at runtime what they actually are, and that's the best way we've found to handle them. But it is a difficult situation, especially with bidirectional languages. You have to worry about, oh, is this going to be from right to left or left to right? It proves to be a difficult challenge. The other part that I want to talk about is that you don't want to be a hero when you're trying to do internationalization. Don't try to like reuse things as much as you would like. Always try to enumerate the different possibilities. Things like sentence builders are really hard to replace with translations. I had to do something similar. We had an activity feed that basically built it up. It was like, given a subject and a verb and an object, and you're like, oh gosh, this is going to be terrible to like enumerate all the different possibilities that could occur. So don't do that. And when you're getting started, it's not too bad as long as you choose a framework. Lots of these frameworks out there have accomplished a lot of these pitfalls that I've talked about. But just make sure it's, like we've talked about in any architecture conference, that it's maintainable, it's modifiable, it's testable, and you can obviously translate with it. And make sure it addresses all the main pitfalls that we discussed in this presentation. So we're going to open up to the questions if you guys have any. Again, disclaimer, not a globalization expert, just kind of talking from my experience and kind of the pitfalls that I ran into while doing this. And I'm open to any sort of commentary that the crowd or the attendees have about more specific globalization techniques that they might have found in their situations. So.
Oftentimes, like, I guess the user interface team might have certain very clear ideas as to what they want things to look like. In terms of, I want this button to be exactly 34 pixels wide.
Yes.
And have this string in there. And from their perspective, it's all static, so they can decide that's not very clear. Whereas if you're having different languages and stuff, things might be different dimensions. Things might not be possible as much.
Right.
Is that an issue you ran into at all? Or
Yes.
So how do you
Yeah.
to tell them to make everything bigger?
No, so you definitely do have to consider, when you do have UI elements that have pixel widths and other sorts of constraints like that, you need to think about, like, if I have some sort of responsive design associated with it, like that it has some sort of overflow to it, so that when your word in German is like 60 characters long when it was like 4 in English, you have to make sure that you account for that possibility. And the best way to do that is to kind of run these tests in these other language packs, that foo language pack I talked to you about. The best way to do that is just replace them with longer strings of characters and see how your UI responds to that, and identify issues like that. And then when you do run into those issues, you're going to have to come up with solutions. Like if we're using certain language packs that have characters that are longer, or have some sort of overflow considerations, or sometimes you might need to remove them. I know Amazon has some sort of situations where they have certain buttons that appear for English that they don't make them all appear, and they kind of collapse them all into one button when you have like too long of words for the button sizes. So it's definitely a consideration. I'm not saying like I have the solution to it. I'm saying this is things you have to think about when you're doing globalization.
So you talked about bidirectional languages. I was just wondering if you encountered problems with a language like Japanese that's not really read left to right, but it's up and down, and then you read parse each line from the right.
Mm-hmm.
Did that just like magically parse correctly, or was that a language that you had trouble with? Or?
To be honest, we didn't even try that yet. We haven't gotten that far. I threw in the bidirectional stuff because I knew that people would probably ask about it, but we haven't really been able to encounter that problem yet with Japanese. So, but yes, definitely a concern that we need to address. I don't know if anyone else has in the room come up with solutions for stuff like that yet. No.
So what's the advantage of this versus using some sort of translation API? For example, one of my projects, I just used Google's translation API, and it was just, very simple, integrating, but this looked like a lot of work. So what are the pluses and minuses?
So with Google Translates, you're going to have translations that don't necessarily make sense all the time. I don't speak the other languages, so I can't speak from experience, but I know that based on talking to people who do, Google Translate's pretty bad in that sense. And the other problem that you run into is that if you have like variables, for instance, it becomes very difficult to figure out, okay, where did that variable go in the translation that I just put in? I don't know. Like that becomes a problem. So yes, there is a little more work associated with this, and that's why I'm trying to encourage people to try to do this earlier rather than later. Obviously, not everyone has that facility, but just something to think about. We had to dedicate like 2 developers for like an entire quarter, just basically pulling out all these strings in the UI, because not only is it a tedious task, but it's also a tricky task, because you don't want to translate things like CSS classes, because those don't have any purpose to translate. We had that issue a lot because people were just like madly going through code and just being like, okay, that's gone, that's gone, that's gone. And I'd be like, stop, you're doing it wrong. So, but yeah, something important. I know it sucks, but it's not a good idea to use Google Translate as a go-to.
The last slide you called out addresses are a problem.
Addresses main pitfalls.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. I know addresses and phone numbers are also other considerations. Haven't hit that because we don't have any of those in our application. But yes, those are definitely other considerations, especially like how do you dial another number? That's a whole nother talk about dealing with that.
So you talked a little bit about the monetary translation as well. Is there anything similar for currency exchange over there, which is actually very day by day?
Yeah. That's
Something you leverage.
right. There's definitely entire services dedicated to that. You would have to call out to a service. There's not like something baked into the Rails that would allow you to that translate, because like you said, it changes every day. It would have to call out to some sort of conversion service. So currency conversion is very different from displaying the currency in the correct format. So you would have to understand what type of currency it was, and then if it wasn't the currency you were trying to display, that you had the correct mechanism to convert it if that's the thing that you need to do. But yeah, that's definitely another consideration that you would have to abstract into your service if you display currencies.
Have you looked into the problem of that different cultures have different ways of sorting?
Not yet. But I understand that alphabetical sorting, that's definitely an issue for other languages, that not everything goes from A to Z. We haven't, the search engine that backs our UI handles all the sorting for us, so we don't do any visual sorting in the UI, so there hasn't been an issue yet. But I'm sure that if we ever do need to do some visual sorting, that we will have that issue. But yeah, that's a good point to bring up. There's also sorting involved.
All right, that's going to wrap it up. Andrew, thank you.